So I've been watching Star Trek Lower Decks again in preparation for the upcoming crossover between Strange New Worlds and Lower Decks, which I'm extremely excited for. This year, I've actually made it my New Year's resolution to watch all of Star Trek. However, at this point, I've pretty much resigned myself to the knowledge that I'm not going to be able to watch all of it. When I watch TV, it takes me a long time to get through things because I have to pause every 5 seconds and take notes or live blog or text somebody about it or talk to someone. This week when I was watching Enterprise, I actually took about 35 pages of notes because every time something happened, I wanted to write about it. I had thoughts. Star Trek in total is somewhere in the 850 episode range, and it's incredibly daunting for me to get through all of that the way I watch television. And no, I can't really turn it off. It's just not possible for me to sit down and watch 6 episodes of pretty much anything. Except for Lower Decks, which is incredible. I highly recommend Star Trek Lower Decks. Anyway, because of that, I didn't plan on watching Enterprise this year. I figured it was more important to finish some of the longer shows that I was really enjoying. In particular, I found that I really like Voyager. I am about halfway through The Next Generation, which I've been trying to watch since 2015. If you're watching this in the future, it's currently June of 2023. I'm watching the original series, which I'm really enjoying, more than I expected to, and it just didn't seem like watching Enterprise should be high on my priority list. But there's an excellent joke in Lower Decks where Riker says, and this is much funnier in context, he says, those people had a long road, the crew of the Enterprise, getting from there to here. And when I heard that for the 3rd or 4th time watching it again last week, it just cracked me up. Coincidentally, around the same time, for various long story reasons, I have had to put a warm compress on my cat's face for 5 minutes a day, 3 times a day for the past week. Because of this, I have been singing to her a lot. She really hates this warm compress simply because she has to sit still for 5 minutes. It's not hurting her, I promise. So I found that I just, I put the compress on her face and I pet her and stroke her ears, and I sing to her. There's not a lot of songs in my range that I know by heart, so I ended up singing Faith of the Heart about 15 times last week, because it's one of the only songs I can sing comfortably and make it sound comforting in the tones of my voice to my little cat who was not feeling well. And then on Tuesday of this week, I had to take a 2-hour exam, actually right here for one of my classes for grad school. I had to sit down, focus for 2 hours, and wouldn't you know, I couldn't get freaking Faith of the Heart out of my mind. I was taking my test, typing and writing and doing math, and just in the back of my mind was, I got faith, and it just went over and over again in my mind. The song's only about 1 minute and 15 seconds if you don't count the long version, and I was only hearing the 1 minute and 15 second version in my head for 2 hours. So the moment the exam was over, I turned off my computer, I cracked. I went over, I turned on Enterprise, and pretty much for every waking moment that I had free time, since then, I have been watching Enterprise. I can't stop. So we're doing this. I'm going to be talking about Star Trek Enterprise for the next little while. As for the details of this, why have I not been doing this about TNG if I've been watching TNG this year? Why have I not been doing this about Voyager? We'll get to that in a few minutes. How is this going to proceed? How much of the series am I going to do? But for now, I just want to start talking about what Enterprise is. So Enterprise is the 6th, if you count the animated series, I believe, television series of Star Trek. There was a many-year break between the original series and The Next Generation, but The Next Generation was very successful, obviously, and immediately after The Next Generation ended, Deep Space Nine started, and immediately after Deep Space Nine ended, Voyager started, and then immediately after Voyager ended, Enterprise started. But a lot of stuff was really going on when Enterprise was running, namely 9/11. There were writers' strikes, that was not related to 9/11. There were changes in the way television worked. People had TiVo, which didn't I don't know if that strictly affected this, but TV was changing. People's expectations of TV was changing. And so there were a lot of differences in Enterprise versus the 3 previous Star Trek shows, actually the 4 previous Star Trek shows. Namely, it had multiple episode plots, or season-long plots, really. The series as a whole has several arcs that start in the beginning and continue through the end of the series. So Enterprise itself, the series, which if I could change one thing right out of the gate, I would give it a different name. Literally anything else. It's impossible for me to find, discussions or spaceship models or, it's very difficult when the title of the series is the same as the name of the ship that almost every single show uses as the main ship. Anyway, this particular series follows the very first Enterprise that Starfleet ever sent out. It's the first time they sent an exploratory vessel out into space with a crew full of slightly but not entirely militaristic specialists who were trained in Starfleet to go boldly where no man has gone before. The aesthetic and the themes commit really hard to being halfway between NASA, like today, and the aesthetic and practices and expectations of Star Trek, the original series. Ignoring the fact that 90% of everything you're seeing on screen almost at any given time is CG, everything in the series looks incredible. The design of the ships, the design of the way things work on the ship, the design of the procedures they have is wonderfully thought out as to what is humanity going to have figured out after today, but not quite figured out the way they have in the original series. Their ideals and practices are not quite what you would expect from Star Trek. Prime Directive doesn't exist. In the second episode, the characters take a slug from one planet and just put it on a different planet. Actually, we wouldn't do that now, but it's plausible. But it would never, ever happen in a later series. They casually make first contact with any species they come across, regardless of their situation. Because there were longer plots, they were also able to focus more on characterization and character development, as well as long-form development of concepts that later series take in stride. The thing is, for my entire life, or for most of it, whenever I watch The Next Generation, I feel this disappointment, and I'm sorry to everybody who likes TNG. I'm gonna really piss you off, probably the duration of this video series, but I feel this weird disappointment whenever I watch TNG, and I couldn't figure out why. Something will happen and they'll say, oh, Wesley has a science experiment that can solve this problem, or we'll just fire a photon torpedo and it'll do something and just solve the problem. Usually defining the problem in TNG is enough for them to know the solution. And this past Tuesday, when I watched the pilot to Enterprise, I understood suddenly and starkly why I have such a hard time with TNG. And that's that it's not Enterprise. When I was 9 years old, I was really, really into Animorphs. Animorphs was written by Catherine Applegate, who is a fantastic author with the one glaring exception that she feels the need to immediately date all of her work by throwing in just an abundance of extremely current pop culture references. Reading Animorphs, you are bombarded with references to Power Mars and Olivia Newton-John and Star Trek. I was so into Animorphs, and the characters just kept referencing Star Trek that I kept telling my mom that I wanted to check out Star Trek. So one day, she was able to find an episode of Star Trek that was airing. This was, before streaming, obviously. And the show that was on at the time was Enterprise. For pretty much the duration of the year where I was 10 and a half to like 11 and a half, I marinated in Enterprise. Enterprise existed in my mind basically at all times. I loved it. I was memorizing episodes level of obsessed with Enterprise. However, I didn't actually understand most of what was going on. Like, I could comprehend, like, the individual episode plots, but I didn't understand the character nuances or, like, anything that was happening with any political situation. I just didn't get it. I just wanted to be watching Enterprise if it was available. I distinctly remember feeling like I had this tank in my mind that was constantly leaking, and as the liquid was leaking out, the air pressure in the top of the tank was decreasing from, vacuum, and I felt like my head was that vacuum, and it was being sucked emotionally somehow. But when I watched Enterprise, it was like more liquid was being added into the tank. The pressure was being alleviated. I really loved it. You could say that I was an Enterprise fan. However, when you are a giant, humongous, the biggest Enterprise fan at the age of 10, it makes TNG borderline unwatchable. This is what I wrote this week. I was probably halfway through episode 5 when I wrote this. I said, I love that their spaceship fucking sucks. They almost blow up if they try to go warp 5. They don't have shields, they don't have a tractor beam, but they do have a grappling hook. They don't have a holodeck, so they all get off on every strange planet so they can stretch their legs, and every single time they almost die. They're terrified of the transporter, so they don't use it. Everyone's quarters are tiny because they're using NASA's spaceship design sensibility. Senior officers eat dinner in what's barely distinguishable from an airplane bathroom. They go the first couple episodes without having weapons, and then when they do get weapons, they don't really do anything because every other species except for humans have invented shields. They haven't invented the Prime Directive, so they literally carry a random space slug from one planet to a different planet in the second episode. The linguist is populating the universal translator that future crews will be using. The whole crew is younger because they have to be like astronauts, but that also means that none of them have a fucking clue what they're doing at any given time and are well and truly making shit up as they go along. If they want to use their one shuttle, they have to lower themselves into it with a retractable ladder, retract the ladder, attach a docking arm, open a hatch, get removed from the ship with the docking arm, which takes about 45 seconds, and then they can start flying. If they want to get back in the ship, they have to do that in reverse and wait for the slow-ass docking arm to bring them back inside while they're being shot at. I would like to amend this statement with, it does turn out they have a second shuttle. The point is, every victory in Enterprise feels more earned because they are the weakest underdogs in the galaxy. Everybody that they encounter has a better, stronger, faster ship than they do. And basically every episode, our characters have to either really cleverly outsmart the situation or be humble and ask someone bigger than them for help. It makes every victory feel so much more earned. It also makes it so that the audience can actually think about how to solve the problems. Not to an incredible extent. It still feels like Phlox just knows the answer to a whole lot of the questions, but they don't even have photon torpedoes. They have physical torpedoes. Like, they have to load these physical boxy-ass torpedoes into a chamber that gets, shot out, and then anyway. So I have to say I'm a huge Enterprise fan. I was actually never planning on rewatching Enterprise because I loved it so intensely that I assumed watching it again would be painful. And the first episode, honestly, painful as all hell. It's good. It's also very bad. But I kept watching, and it's genuinely quite good. Enterprise has a reputation for being the worst Star Trek, which I think is a crime. There are a lot of things that Enterprise is trying very, very genuinely to do. For one, the halfway mark of world building is fantastic. The character development and the attention to character detail in each episode is so far beyond what most of the other Star Trek shows even attempt. Some of the episodes are bad. The decontamination chamber is a pointless, horrible idea. But the show is genuinely good. And if you don't agree, I feel bad for you. So for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be going over Star Trek Enterprise. However, there's a caveat. I don't know how long I'm going to be doing this. And I don't know how often either. For one, I'm in the middle of an extremely stressful life situation, but also the biggest problem with Star Trek Enterprise is its finale. The last episode of the series is atrocious. It genuinely ruins the viewing experience for, like, even the beginning of the show. It's widely considered to be the worst episode in Star Trek, simply by virtue of the fact that it retroactively ruins the rest of Enterprise. It's a giant fuck you to the series, and I have no intention of ever watching it again. My intention was pretty much to keep watching until I lost interest, because when I was a kid, because this was my first Star Trek, my opinion of it didn't improve over time. It actually degraded. I liked the first 2 seasons a lot, I liked the 3rd season less, and I didn't like the 4th season very much. I figured that might remain the case when I watch it again, and that maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't care to watch past season 3, and I wouldn't have to convince myself not to watch that last episode. No matter what, though, I won't be watching it. However, in order to prepare for this recording, I actually sat down and watched a little clip from one of these episodes, and I found that there's a series of books that follow up the series and repair some of the damage done by the original finale. For that reason, I am at this point undecided how much of the series I'm going to be covering. I could cover through season 3, I could cover through the penultimate episode, or I could power through the atrocious finale and read those 9 books that are, according to this one commenter on YouTube, actually quite good. I don't know which of those things I'm going to be doing, but for now, I'm just going to start talking about Enterprise, because I was shocked by the amount of meat in each of these episodes. Not just the pilot, but all of them. It feels like more care and intention is placed into every line, every scene, every subplot than there is in most of the other Star Trek shows I've seen. I feel really bad shitting on TNG because it is genuinely a good show, but for almost every episode, I feel like the pieces are just being moved around. I'm a terrible chess player, and there always comes a point when I'm playing some other terrible chess player where we're just kind of chasing our pieces around the board and nothing's actually happening. And that's how I feel watching 90% of TNG episodes. There's no intention to develop the characters over time. There's no intention to develop many of the plots over time. Elements are added to characters that literally do not matter, and they're explored at a surface level for no reason. I promise I will stop shitting on TNG as soon as possible. The point is, Enterprise seems to have set out to not do that. I'll be the first to say that Enterprise is not the best Star Trek show. It is good, and I like it the most, but I'm not gonna stand here and say that anything is objectively better than anything else. In fact, like I said, I really, really enjoy Voyager, which of course I hear also has problems, and I'll go ahead and say it. I think objectively the best Star Trek show, if you ignore the fact that the first 6 episodes are not good and annoying, is Lower Decks. But I really like Enterprise. And much like its cast, there's a lot of things it is trying its damnedest to do, and maybe it falls short. But I give him credit for trying. So now I want to talk about the 8 episodes that I watched this week. It's going to be difficult to get through this because I feel like I could have done an entire 2-hour breakdown just of the pilot. It's astonishing to me how much this show is entirely different now that I am not 10 years old. Since I am intellectually capable of understanding certain things, it's like a whole new layer, but by layer I mean like 10 layers have been opened up to me simply because I am able to follow political plot lines and capable of recognizing when two people have romantic interest in each other. Things that I simply did not notice when I was 10 because my brain hadn't developed enough. So in many ways, I'm experiencing a lot of parts of this show for the very first time. But the parts that I liked when I was a kid, I still like. So I'm going to start with kind of going over everybody in the cast kind of quickly, and then I'm going to give a quick overview of each of the 8 episodes. There's quite a bit that I'm summarizing out of this, but I'm hoping that we can circle back to some of these things in future episodes of this video series. I hope you guys enjoy it, and please watch Enterprise. The first episode is cringy and cheesy and overly horny, but keep watching after that, please. So I want to talk about the crew. I will say, I think that of the several main selling points of the series, one of them is definitely the character development. The characters are much more flawed, but also much more capable of growth in Enterprise, perhaps, than any other Star Trek series. It appears to have been something they decided to focus on within the conceptualization of the series itself. The way they do this is that everyone in the crew has a conscious motivation, one that they are aware of, and a subconscious motivation, one that the audience is aware of that they are not. It's pretty easy to see what everybody's conscious and subconscious motivations are, but even if the audience can see it, the fact that that foundation exists makes it easier for the writers to come up with compelling things for the characters to be doing at any given time. Enterprise was famously plagued by executive meddling. All kinds of suits were constantly telling the writers, oh, you need to do more of this. Now you gotta do less of it. Ooh, we don't care about that plot line anymore. Stop doing it. Ooh, here's a new plot line. Never mind, don't do that plot line. And it caused the series to suffer in many people's eyes, rightfully so. But I don't really judge the series for that because it's been over for 20 years. So, 18 years. So I just kind of see it as something that exists. But when you do excellent gardening from the beginning, when you define the capabilities of your spaceship, you define the characters in your crew in more dimensions than you might end up needing later, you end up with a better product. You don't have so much of this pushing pieces around on the chessboard because you don't really know what you can be doing right now. So let's start with the crew. We're going to start with Archer, the captain, played by Scott Bakula. Archer is very different from most of the other captains because he is the very first Enterprise captain. He has no one to look up to. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, everyone in the cast is younger than, say, the TNG cast or the DS9 cast. They're less established, they have less experience, and Archer is no exception. However, he thinks of himself as the exception. He was raised to be this figure, effectively. Archer reminds me a lot of Holden, the main character in The Expanse. Holden in The Expanse is the child of 8 parents who wanted to pass on a piece of land that he was supposed to protect, into adulthood. So all of these expectations that he's going to be the hero of this small story is how he thought of himself growing up. And it causes him to be a little bit big for his britches. He thinks he's very, very important and totally qualified to make decisions that he's not necessarily qualified to make. Archer is a lot like Holden in that way. His father was one of the inventors of the warp drive, and he was always in or around Starfleet for what appears to be his entire life. He was selected to be the captain, so he thinks of himself as being this representative for humanity. Both from the perspective of the humans back on Earth, he feels like he's representing them when he goes out, but he also feels like he's representing humanity when he's speaking to these new creatures, these new species that they meet. So Archer is carrying his father's legacy. He's the representative for humanity to whatever species they meet, and he also sees himself as the tip of the spear for humanity. And he is almost good enough to live up to his expectations for himself, but he's not quite there, at least at the beginning of the series. See, one of Archer's main flaws, or his biggest flaw at this point in the series, is that he hates Vulcans. At this point in the timeline, Vulcans have made first contact with Earth, but have also sort of assigned themselves guardianship over the humans, but they're also not helping them make any technological progress, and in many ways have hindered humans' technological progress, at least in Archer's eyes. Archer has a lot of resentment for Vulcans for the fact that his father never got to see the Enterprise go out into space and fulfill his dream. But this resentment towards Vulcans goes deeper. Archer sees emotionality as the thing that makes humans human. He sees humans as being the opposite of Vulcans, and so in many ways he behaves illogically, sometimes on purpose. He wants to go with his gut consciously because he does not want to be like Vulcans. And in that way, emotionality is what makes a person a person. When he's interacting with characters who are less emotional, he sees them as less of people. This causes a real problem when he gets his first officer, T'Pol, a Vulcan who is assigned by the Vulcan High Council to serve on his ship. Originally, Archer intended for his best friend Trip to be his first officer. Trip is the chief engineer on the ship, but T'Pol is assigned to him, and they don't get along. And as of episode 8, they still don't get along. The way the main three characters interact is one of the strongest elements of Enterprise. Trip, T'Pol, and Archer make their own power trio that is completely distinct from the power trio that existed in the original series between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. With Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, you had this id-ego, super-ego dynamic based on, it's called a Freudian triangle. But there's a variation on that that's pretty significant in Enterprise, in that the trio instead is the hero, the Lancer, and the heart. Archer sees himself as the hero, he's the leader, whatever he does is right in his eyes because he feels as if he is basically a chosen one in many ways. T'Pol is a Lancer. She operates differently than he does, even though they have the same goals, and this causes resentment between them. And Trip, an empathetic person, is the person who can sort of facilitate communication between them, but also sort of shows them an alternate way to communicate. Both T'Pol and Archer are really super into the rationalization. They feel things intensely and then come up with a reason why they should feel them, or why their feelings are right. Trip, on the other hand, is much more willing to just say that he feels things. In his eyes, having a feeling is good enough reason for something to be valid. This causes a really interesting dynamic that we are going to spend so much time talking about, so I'm going to move on and talk a little bit more about T'Pol. T'Pol is the Vulcan first officer and also the science officer on the ship. She is also a bit too big for her britches and parallels Archer in many ways. She is a sub-commander, so she is technically a rank below Trip, and she does come across as such. She has extensive knowledge of all kinds of protocols, but you always get the sense that she's hiding a relative lack of experience in actual space exploration. She is still a very good officer, but she has skipped a rank above Trip, basically due to her species, which causes some friction between basically everyone involved. She is the only Vulcan that most of the members of the crew, both the bridge crew and the lower decks, have ever actually spent any significant amount of time with, and so they see her as a Vulcan first and a person second. It's abundantly clear to the audience what her conscious and subconscious motivations are, but they all assume that because she doesn't express things outwardly, she actually doesn't feel anything on the inside, even when she straight up tells them that she does. So then the third in command on the ship is Trip. He also comes across as being slightly less experienced than his rank suggests. It seems like he's a very, very good engineer, which is why he's a commander, but he might not necessarily be an excellent commander. The role of first officer is in many ways split between Trip and T'Pol throughout the series, because T'Pol has the knowledge of how to deal with situations, but she doesn't have any leadership ability, really. At least at this point, she doesn't deal with the red shirts. She isn't helpful with people in a crisis. She just knows what the right thing to do is, where Trip is the opposite. He serves as a leader to the lower deckers. He is able to deal with people, but he consistently makes poor decisions in a crisis. I think it's interesting to think about how Star Trek and Starfleet would have been different if Trip had been first officer on the very first Enterprise, because he's the chief engineer, so he spends the vast majority of his time with the warp drive in the engine room. He can't spend so much time on the bridge. He can't help in combat because, well, on the bridge, he's not apprised of most situations, where T'Pol's science officer station happens to be the one that's right next to the captain's chair. So if she needs to be the captain, she just kind of floats back and forth between the two seats. She has a job that is extremely similar to the job that Spock will have 100 years from now. And I wonder if that paradigm would have been different if the Enterprise would have had to develop around Trip not being on the bridge. As far as Trip's actual character concept, he's extremely likable. He's pretty difficult to dislike. I keep saying he's potentially science fiction's most well-known Florida man. He constantly talks about how he's from Florida and he's not afraid of hurricanes. And he's also a country bumpkin. Like, he's constantly talking in a southern accent, talks about southern values. And as a native Floridian, it's very funny to me to see what the writers thought of Floridians in the characterization of Trip Tucker. It's a real treat to have this character. We're not all like this. But most notably, he is an empath, like pathologically. He doesn't have a particularly high emotional intelligence, but he's very stubborn in wanting to get along with people. This is why he's able to get along with T'Pol. Even when they initially clash, Archer is likely to rage quit a conversation with T'Pol that isn't going the way he wants to, but Trip is more likely to stubbornly continue trying to communicate with her until she at least gets Archer's perspective. Trip is fiercely loyal to Archer, but his presence allows a sort of bridge between Archer and T'Pol that wouldn't exist until way later, or with other major disasters otherwise. I actually think it probably wouldn't exist otherwise. We'll get back to the main three later. They are the characters that undergo the most development and have the most depth. So the majority of this video series will probably be talking about those three, but we do have to address the other four members of the crew. First is Phlox. He's the doctor. He's definitely one of my favorite characters. He's just incredibly charismatic and smiley and cheerful, but his cheerfulness isn't immaturity. He comes across as one of the wiser people on the ship. They don't have a counselor, but Phlox is just kind of like a wise older mentor kind of figure who is able to just effortlessly talk to people and get them to feel better. He's a doctor with a really good bedside manner, you could say. And because he's the only other alien on the ship and he's constantly around only other aliens, Phlox is the only person who treats T'Pol like he treats everybody else. He's not necessarily treating T'Pol the way she wants to be treated. She is still a little bit frosty towards him, but she gets along with Phlox immediately better than she gets along with anybody else because Phlox doesn't have this obvious prejudice against her that colors their every interaction. She's just another alien on the ship to him. And of course, it helps that he's very, very nice. Then we got Malcolm Reed. He's a lieutenant. He is the tactical officer. Malcolm Reed is not super developed yet, but he is a cool character. He's kind of a gun nut, but he's not an enthusiast. He's definitely much more of a professional. He takes his job super seriously, but he also would rather die than admit he wants to be here. He's initially introduced to the show making fun of Trip. He's doing a bad impression of Trip to talk about like how much he doesn't like everybody else on the ship. Even though, oh my god, dude, you're going into space. You've been selected to be part of the Enterprise. You could be excited. Then there's Hoshi. She was a teacher on Earth, and she's kind of struggling to acclimate to life in space. She's basically the best linguist that exists, but which is why she was brought onto the ship, but she doesn't like exosuits. She doesn't like, space. She's vaguely uncomfortable with being on the Enterprise. She was also friends with Archer before this. Did Archer just bring all of his friends onto the ship? Who am I forgetting? Oh my god, Travis. Travis I did not write down, but Travis is actually a total sweetheart. He is the only person in the ship who has never whined about anything in the first 8 episodes, which makes him my favorite right now. Travis was the only member of the ship who actually grew up in space. So he grew up on cargo freighters, and I think the show actually does the best job with Travis making these little details about his character that kind of tie into the whole theme. He mentions early on that his dad always left the gravity at 0.8 Gs to put a spring in his step. But because of that, Travis is kind of struggling being on this 1G ship because he just doesn't have the physique to keep up with it. He knows a lot of space ghost stories. He can't really sleep outside. And piloting the ship is just a natural thing to him. You can tell that he joined Starfleet, and it's not that he's not trying, but he certainly doesn't find his job difficult. Okay, so now I want to get into the 8 episodes that I watched. We're going to have to really kind of skim over these, which sucks. Like I said, the pilot, I feel like I could have done a 2-hour breakdown on, but we're just going to kind of go over it now. So the pilot deals with one of the main thematic through lines of the series immediately, and it's probably going to remain very important for a very long time, which is this friction between the humans and the Vulcans. The humans and the Vulcans are in conflict over who's going to bring this Klingon back to the Klingon homeworld, and whether or not they're going to do so with the Klingon alive. Archer insists on going out, and he's assigned T'Pol to go with him. T'Pol is sort of this pivot character in the first episode where she sort of represents the Vulcan species for most of the episode. She represents the way people feel about Vulcans, but mostly she represents the way Vulcans feel about humans. She's extremely bitchy to the point of being irritating in episode 1. And she remains pretty bitchy for several episodes, but it does kind of drag the episode down, in my opinion. The emotional arc of the episode is basically that Archer wants to go out. He has to bring T'Pol with him. T'Pol is a bit of a problem. She makes Archer uncomfortable because she's a Vulcan, but she also ends up taking over the ship when Archer gets shot. However, it turns out in a dramatic twist at the end of the episode that T'Pol is actually a great first officer, and he ends up asking her to stay on the ship. But the first episode is actually 2 episodes long, and for most of that, you're just watching T'Pol be mean. Which is not awesome, to be completely honest. But there's something else that's even less awesome, and that's the fucking decon chamber. So, I did a previous video series on this channel about Hive, which was one of my favorite books when I was a kid, and I did it with this girl, Mitch. You can see plenty of videos on this channel where I have Mitch commentate on things, and she's a genius, and I love her, and she loves Star Trek, and I talked her into trying Enterprise. I hadn't watched Enterprise since I was 10, and she started watching it. She goes, "Jade, this is so sexual. Why are you having me watch this? This is weird and gross." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Is Mitch really sensitive? Did I miss it?" Yeah, I missed it. I told my friend when I was in the middle of this episode, I said, "I feel like I'm watching the porn version of Enterprise and the regular version of Enterprise at the same time, and like each scene it switches back and forth between them." So Enterprise the series got a ton of shit for the decontamination chamber. So they don't have a holodeck, but they do have a sexual tension box that everybody gets into whenever they need to pass a little bit of time and talk about the values of the episode, which is that, every time they go down to a planet, they once they come back from the planet, they have to decontaminate so they don't like bring anything onto the ship. And that means that they strip and rub each other down with this very lube-looking liquid. And I'm a grown woman, okay? I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but I am an adult. I am not a sheltered adult either, but I was watching this scene in the privacy of my own home alone at 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was so embarrassed I had to cover my eyes during the decontamination scene. It's ridiculous how sexual it is. How the hell this series is rated PG, I don't know. You can see Jolene Blaylock's nipples like poking through the fabric while she's arguing. It's absurd. It breaks my immersion. It was ridiculous. Anyway. But I swear the rest of them are not this sexual. In the next 8 episodes, or the 7 episodes that follow, they didn't show the decontamination chamber at all. There was no sexual content, no horny anything. It was just so weird because it didn't feel like there was artistry to it. I mean, there was some amount of artistry, but like not really. It was just, all right, it's time for our regularly scheduled horny scene, I guess. I commented in a live blog that I was doing of this that it feels like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too when it came to like sexual content. You know, there are some characters who will get together later, and I don't honestly remember if we see anything of them having sex or whatever, but the series wanted to develop their relationships over time, but they also wanted to have sexual content early. So how are they going to get around that? They're going to have the characters forced to rub lube on each other, pretty much. It's bizarre. So this is a great establishing episode for a lot of the concepts that the series is really going to rely on, but it also has some annoying and weird elements. There are some other elements to the story that feel just like pointlessly horny, but in addition to that, you know, T'Pol just acts like more of a bitch than she... Like, it is consistent within her character, but the amount of screen time where she's just arguing with people is grating. And then she and Trip get into 5 completely separate, pointless arguments. Oh, well, okay. One of the arguments has a point, and the rest of them are just them fighting, so that you know they're eventually gonna not fight anymore. Would I still recommend watching the pilot? Yes, absolutely. Just know that the bad elements get kind of massaged out. No pun intended. Fight or Flight is the next episode. It's a Hoshi episode, but the Hoshi stuff is so bare bones, like it literally feels like nothing. Phlox continues to be the best character. So they pick up this slug and take it to a different planet, like I mentioned, which is it's just kind of a charming thing because you kind of laugh because you're like, ha, they don't have a prime directive. I gotta talk about the captain's logs. All right, so I forgot to mention so at the end of the pilot, Archer asks T'Pol to stay on the ship and be his first officer, but he says, it would be embarrassing if I told Starfleet that I needed you on the ship. So instead, I want you to go to the Vulcan High Command and say that you just want to be on the ship so badly. Please stay with me. I need your help, but I'm not willing to admit to anyone that I need your help. She says, okay, sure, because he saved her life earlier in the episode, which he angsts about. I saved her life, and now she's more loyal to me. But why? Which is just annoying as all hell.
There's a big storm, and she doesn't like thunderstorms.
Speaking of pets, she's under the table, which is why I'm sitting like this. Archer has a dog who is adorable. This is the cutest beagle. I mean, beagles are adorable, and I also think beagles are adorable because of this show. But Porthos is so cute. He's so cute. So we got to talk about the captain's logs. So basically, T'Pol did Archer a huge favor by even coming onto the ship the way she did. But Archer is still uncomfortable with having her around, like in his conscious mind. Subconsciously, he trusts T'Pol completely. He spends almost no time on the bridge in the first several episodes. He's just he manages by walking around, so he leaves T'Pol in charge of his massive many-billion-dollar starship, and that's just their dynamic. He treats her, like, from an ops perspective, exactly like any other starship captain has treated their number one in all of Star Trek. He's comfortable giving her command in a crisis situation. But when he has time to think, the doubts start to creep in. So, up to where I am, in episode 8, every single one of his captain's logs have been about how uncomfortable he is having T'Pol on the ship. So, to be clear, he leaves T'Pol in charge of his starship so that he can go to his room and brood about how he does not trust her. It's ridiculous. But that wouldn't really mean anything because that's just his stupid diary, right? What matters is how he treats her and, like, you know, between the two of them, or how he treats her in front of the crew, which he also does, like, pretty poorly at. And by pretty poorly, I mean very poorly. In Fight or Flight, they come across this ship which is full of people who have been murdered. They don't have weapons yet, so they come back onto the ship. T'Pol, who is, to be fair, still a total bitch in this episode. T'Pol says, we really need to get out of here. We don't know if the murderers are going to come back. We don't have weapons. The logical thing to do is leave. And Archer feels bad about this, but agrees with her, and they leave. So a couple days later, the guilt of leaving this ship full of corpses behind starts eating him up inside, and then he just loses it. Like, he doesn't completely lose it, but he decides that he's gonna blame T'Pol for this. He says that it's T'Pol's fault that they left those people. As a reminder, Archer is the captain. T'Pol can't make him do anything. She's there to give advice and take over when he's not there. And other than that, she reads sensors. But there's this uncomfortable dinner scene where Archer feels really bad about the fact that they left this ship behind, and he lashes out at T'Pol for the fact that he made that decision, frankly. He starts basically dragging her into this lengthy, imaginative scenario where he's like, how would you feel if it was a ship full of Vulcans? And she's like, I don't know. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't a ship full of Vulcans, but we don't have weapons. Like, we don't have any weapons. So he eventually decides, all right, I feel really bad about this. We're going to turn around. And wouldn't you know, when they go back, they almost get killed by the people who killed all those people. And they have to get rescued by somebody else because they don't have any weapons. They do actually have some weapons at that. Like, that's the point when they start having weapons. But Archer lashes out at T'Pol when he has time to think about whether or not he trusts her. In an emergency, he trusts her, but, like, if he's left alone, he starts going, ooh, man, how did I get myself into this situation with having a Vulcan on my starship? You know, and it drives me bonkers. The thing is, I still see Scott Bakula as Samuel Beckett, the protagonist of Quantum Leap, which was his other big role, really. And that's probably because Archer becomes a better captain over time. But the point is, like, I get the impression that Scott Bakula is actually, like, a really nice guy. And then when Archer just suddenly becomes an asshole because he is, it feels weird. It feels wrong. And so far over the course of the past 8 episodes, he's really improved on, like, the balance and the characterization, but also, you know, not doing this. But when he does do it, it feels so wrong because it feels bad for a starship captain. It feels bad for the character. I didn't like it. Last note from Fight or Flight, just proof that the decontamination chamber is pointless. They come in off of this spaceship where people have been left dead for, like, organ farming purposes. They are getting ready to get into the decontamination chamber when T'Pol comes in and has a whole conversation with the 3 people who were on the spaceship who have not yet decontaminated. No attention is called to it. Nobody cares. The decontamination chamber is pointless and stupid. Anyway, then there's the next episode. I just put cave. I don't remember what it was called. Night Terror. No, it's not Night Terrors. That's the one in TNG where Troy is communicating with her nightmares and stuff. Anyway, I love Travis's ghost stories. I've already mentioned that. Later on, Travis and Malcolm make a snowman on a comet. These kinds of details where like we're showing how humanity has started to get used to living in space. They kind of don't exist in the other shows. Like the detail, this kind of it's not really there. I like the ensign there's an ensign who is a scientist. She studies insects, so she works under T'Pol, and she just kind of like takes a bit of a liking to T'Pol, and she tries the plomeek broth that T'Pol eats for breakfast and stuff, and T'Pol just doesn't care. Okay, I didn't even write this in my notes. My favorite part of this episode, so they go down to this planet, and they camp out on this planet so they can have like a little bit of shore leave. You know, like I said at the beginning, they don't have a holodeck, so they just go to whatever planet they can find. They just got to stretch their legs. So they go down and go camping, and the 4 human crew members are sharing a tent, and then T'Pol is in a separate tent where she's just kind of sitting creepily looking through the window into their tent, and she just like periodically calls Trip to give commentary on what they're doing in the other tent. It's so stupid. It's very funny. So we see our first transporter accident. The characters in this show are completely right to be afraid of the transporter because their transporter is simply not very good. One of the crew members gets caught outside in a storm. They transport him back to the ship, and his skin has fused with a bunch of like branches and leaves that were blowing past him in the storm, as their transporter like couldn't tell the difference between them and just kind of very bad. He does survive, but it's a surprise that he does for sure. They go into this cave. It turns out that there's spores on this planet that make everybody crazy, and Trip becomes paranoid and tries to kill T'Pol. This is the start of a plot line that I call in my mind, why doesn't T'Pol just leave? But the resolution of this episode is really great because Archer has to actually be a good captain. This is the first time we see him show real leadership and genuinely be a good captain and behave the way I expect Archer to behave. But I also like the resolution where the following morning, Trip tells T'Pol that his 10th grade science teacher was a Vulcan. And at one point when he was hallucinating, he hallucinates that his 10th grade science teacher, who was a Vulcan, is telling him that he should not kill T'Pol. I think it shows that Trip's distrust of Vulcans is largely him mirroring Archer because they're friends and because he genuinely sees Archer as a leader and someone he trusts. And because of that, he's taken on this distrust of Vulcans that is really not natural for him. And because of the way this resolved, I can see why T'Pol didn't leave after this episode. I'm going somewhere with this why didn't T'Pol not leave thing. Then we get Unexpected. I love this episode. It is so good. This is the one where Trip gets pregnant. This is considered to be the first great episode of Enterprise. This is the one where I feel like Connor Trinneer really locked in his characterization of Trip. The entire cast has some flavor of petulant in the beginning, but Trip is the only one who makes it like funny and charming. Trip really just whines and feels bad for himself for the entire episode, but he has the comedic acting chops to back it up. You're laughing at him instead of being annoyed by him, and that takes acting chops for sure. It's interesting how like going forward into the next few episodes, we're gonna see the point where each actor really connects with their character, and it's always in an episode that is really about their character. But Trip being pregnant is just a hilarious episode. He's sort of okay with the idea of being a dad, but he doesn't want to be pregnant, and he's totally right to not want to be pregnant because, I mean, other than, you know, the obvious ethical reasons, the baby is growing between 2 of his ribs, and that would be very bad. I suppose this is the first episode that contains an actual on-screen sex scene, except what it is that this alien girl that Trip meets, they stick their hands into this bowl with rice in it, and the rice is actually like sticking their hands into the rice is the way their species has sex, but Trip just doesn't know this. He thinks it's a fun, okay, we're gonna stick our hands in rice, But it's funny that, 4 episodes ago we had this ridiculously, stupidly, non-tastefully horny scene with Trip and T'Pol in the decontamination chamber arguing and rubbing each other with goop. And then the first actual sex scene is Trip sticking his hands in a bowl of rice. It's entertaining for me. Also, notably, the girl that Trip, like, he seems to like her, on a personal level, but not on, like, he makes a comment about, her being a sensual woman, but he doesn't, like, think about her too much. He doesn't really regret not seeing her anymore. But they get along. So his baby mama, or whatever you call her, she has a lizardy face, but otherwise you are supposed to think that she strongly resembles T'Pol. She has, touch-based telepathy, and she wears this gray cat suit, and she's about the same height. She's just nice, and T'Pol isn't. But it was just a fun detail. I've seen a couple of people say that this episode should have been more about, like, the ethics of pregnancy, like unwanted pregnancies and, like, all that kind of stuff, but I don't think so. This is considered to be the first really great episode of Enterprise. It's a complete product. It's fun. Everybody involved is having a great time. There's a point where T'Pol is roasting Trip for going on this 3-day trip and getting pregnant, and Archer Scott Bakula is having just an obviously horrible time staying in character. You can see him laughing. He's, like, covering his face while T'Pol just continually just lays it on him, and it's hysterical. Everybody in the episode is having a great time. The direction is good. Like I said, Connor Trinneer's acting really locks in here, and he stays, as far as I remember, like, he stays pretty consistent for the rest. And this is the point where that all comes together. I also love Phlox in this episode. He's so charming, and he has so much empathy, and he just has, like, the perfect bedside manner for a doctor. I've seen so many online comments where people are like, I've never met a doctor who is as much of a doctor as Phlox. It's a good characterization of Phlox. Next episode is Terra Nova. That's the one where they find this abandoned colony of humans. There's not a lot of creativity to this. Like, it generally takes the turns that you would think that it would take, but what's notable about it is it really shows how slow progress has been for them. They're really not achieving. They're just at the point where they're making their very first contact with an uncontacted race, and it's humans. Like, they're just another group of humans, pretty much. And Archer even comments on that. They do figure it out. It's difficult for them, but they do figure it out. I appreciated that Travis. This establishes that for certain that Travis has a thing for ghost stories. It wasn't just the other episode. He's into it now too. I'm not sure if there was less to this one or if I'm just very sleepy, but we're gonna move on. There is one more thing I want to say about this episode, though, leading into the next one. Archer says that if he's going to be this ambassador for humanity, if he's going to, reach across the species divide for, as the captain of the Enterprise, he has to be able to make first contact with humans. He thinks of this as, like, the bare minimum. This is level 1, but there is a level 0. There is something that is more basic than this. There is a challenge in his character that is less complex than this first contact with this whole colony of 58 people. And that is getting along with T'Pol. At this point, T'Pol has stopped being a bitch. I mean, she's still a little bit of a bitch, but it's definitely much more of a charming, comedic level of bitchiness and not an actual problem. The thing is that Archer, in many ways, lucked out getting T'Pol. It's like, you are given this first officer who's also a very accomplished science officer from another planet, who knows who knows the galaxy, who knows languages you don't know, who knows who knows practices from other cultures that you've never even heard of. And she's not necessarily the best possible first officer who exists, but she's at least, let's call her an 8 out of 10. She's completely loyal to him, and she always does her best. But what's wrong with her? What's the catch? She has pointy ears, and she only eats vegetables. And And in Archer's eyes, the fact that she has pointy ears and only eats vegetables is more important than any of those other things. And he, so far, has never been able to let it go. If he can't, he thinks that level 1 is making contact with Terra Nova, but level 0 is being able to get along with the one crew member that he almost has no reason to not get along with. Of course, T'Pol has her own problems and flaws, but that's not Archer's problem, really. Archer needs to work with her. Archer needs to be able to work with the alien on his bridge. And we're going to see how that goes in the Andorian incident, which is the next episode. I wish I'd forgotten the twist in this one, but somebody mentioned it like right before I started this episode. It really kind of took the wind out of it. We're going to talk more about the implications of Vulcans having the spy technology in a future episode of this video series, but I do want to touch on, of course, several of the things that are introduced here. We meet the Andorians, who will be recurring characters. They're a very militaristic, also telepathic, I believe, species that is close to Vulcan. And they're in a cold war with the Vulcans, but the Vulcans have greater technological power, and so they are very suspicious of the Vulcans. Archer sees Vulcans as an enemy. The Andorians are an enemy of the Vulcans, so does that mean that he should ally with the Andorians? At this point, he kind of sees it as a possibility, but we don't see a reason why he should ally with the Andorians. They are an enemy of the Vulcans, but that does not mean they are a friend. We have not seen them have any positive qualities. Although we will be getting more of them. This will continue. At this point, both options are pretty bad. But this is the episode where I felt like Archer started feeling like the Archer I expect. This is like from an acting perspective and the way he solves and approaches problems. That being said, as I alluded to, I still have a problem with his treatment of T'Pol in this episode. Every single person they meet, enemy or friend, he feels the need to tell them, oh, this is my science officer. I don't want to have her here. I was forced to, have T'Pol on my ship. Reminder, he asked her to stay. He can't stop qualifying her presence on the bridge. He can't admit that he trusts her. He can't even admit to himself that he trusts her. And I have to compare this to Janeway. I feel like when you're watching this, you might not necessarily notice it, but I have to compare this to Janeway. Janeway was the captain of Voyager, who lost her first officer in the first episode and had to take the captain of an enemy ship as her first officer, as the two ships had to merge into one ship. And that's how Voyager starts. Spoilers for the first episode of Voyager, I guess. Chakotay is her first officer throughout the series, and they work as a team. Chakotay was her enemy. She was spying on him before the series started because he was an enemy of Starfleet. He was commanding a ship that was against Starfleet. And she never doesn't support him as her first officer. I've only seen the first season. Early on in the series, people questioned Chakotay's legitimacy as an authority figure on the ship, and Janeway backs him up every time. She says, I have chosen Chakotay to be my right hand, and you will listen to him because his authority comes from me. I have his back, and you will have his back. And Archer can't do that with T'Pol, and it's a problem. It is leadership to back up the authority of your first officer. It's basic shit. But he continually allows people to undermine T'Pol's authority. He doesn't even introduce her as his first officer. He says she's his science officer, which is true, but it's not the whole truth. For the first time in the series, T'Pol is visually, emotionally hurt when they've been captured by these Andorians. He offers her a blanket. They share this blanket, and he starts a little conversation with her, but then he turns it to, hey, I need to know if you're going to betray me because we're around these other Vulcans. And she says, I've never disobeyed an order from you. And she looks genuinely surprised and hurt that he said that. She doesn't speak to him for another half the episode, and rightfully so. Then at the end of the episode, when it turns out that the Vulcans have the spy station, she he makes her prove her loyalty to him in front of everybody. He constantly needs a reassurance that she's loyal to him. And it's not good leadership. If he really can't work with her, he needs to demote her and make Trip his number one, or say, you know what, I'm going to trust her until something happens, because this is ridiculous, and it's going to happen again in the next episode. In Breaking the Ice, which is our first actual Trip and T'Pol episode, even though there have been like 4 that dealt with them. Basically, Trip finds this transmission that is going to T'Pol, and he wonders if it might be some traitorous transmission. Archer tells him to decrypt it and read her personal mail. Trip reads it, and then it turns out it is a very personal letter dealing with her own, like, personal life. So he tells Archer, okay, well, it turns out T'Pol didn't betray us. I have to come clean to her. And Archer goes, why? Why do you need to come clean to her? You know, it doesn't matter. And this I see as a utter, this one thing I would see as an utter failure of leadership from Archer, but it happens in every freaking episode. He ordered his second officer to spy on his first officer. Actually, he ordered Hoshi and Trip to spy on his first officer. And then when it turns out that it was for nothing, like, he feels no accountability towards it. He doesn't need to address it. He sees her as less of a person because he doesn't think that she'll care. He doesn't think she has feelings. And so her dignity isn't important. It drives me bonkers. And right now, I would give, like, if I had to grade Archer, I would give him a D. And it's because every single episode he has to do this. He could be at a B- right now if he literally didn't do it. But he keeps doing it. Stop doing it. The Vulcans are getting all up in the humans' business. As a side note, this episode, Breaking the Ice, which is the last one we're going to cover, is the one where I feel like Jolene Blaylock really had figured out how she was going to play T'Pol. Previously, she was just stiff 100% of the time, and she didn't have like a whole lot of variation in the types of stiff that she was. It was to the point where I was like, I don't feel like this is kind of believable. Like, how could a person go through life being this stiff? Like, you have to have a baseline. And in this episode, she really starts to show that baseline. She has a couple of different flavors of stiff and resting bitch face that feel much more like the way a stoic person would just behave. I'm much more satisfied with her performance. I mean, not that I was unsatisfied with her performance previously, but this is the point where she feels much more like a person. So the Vulcans are getting all up in the humans' business, and what's interesting about this episode is that T'Pol is starting to see herself as part of the humans team in the series-long pissing contest between the humans and the Vulcans, that the Vulcans are trying to gaslight the humans into thinking is all in their head. But no, the Vulcans are 100% participating. Trip has apparently taken it upon himself to be T'Pol's friend, or at least recognize her various, like, types of stiffness. And it turns out that T'Pol is in an arranged marriage and needs to decide whether she's going to go back home to fulfill her obligation to her fiance on Vulcan, which would mean ending her time on the Enterprise, or coming back, or committing to staying on the Enterprise. Now that I say this out loud, I realized that this was like a way for the writers, because she said she would have to leave for a year. I realized this was a way for the writers to write in a convenient way for Jolene Blaylock to potentially be gone for 1 season. Anyway, it's notable that she didn't even get this letter from the guy or like her parents, but it comes from the guy's parents because they see her as property. She tells Trip about this, and he is immediately horrified. He tells her, like, hey, humans stopped doing this because it's barbaric. And she goes, well, I'm a Vulcan and we don't want things. I can't not want to be treated as property because that would mean I wanted something. The thing is, Vulcans see their own emotions as dangerous. They feel more acutely than humans, and so they're more volatile. So culturally, they all play into repressing each other and encouraging each other to repress themselves. But T'Pol is young enough to just barely be willing to consider the idea that maybe relaxing a tiny little bit would be okay. Or specifically, that it might be nice to occasionally be selfish. The fact is, she has an obligation to the Enterprise, and she has an obligation to this cost person, so it's logical to fulfill either of them. So Trip asks her, well, which one do you want to do? And she kind of blue screens about this question. She thinks she needs to find the more logical choice, even though you can easily rationalize either of these decisions. So Trip kind of convinces her that, well, or demonstrates to her that if she stays on the Enterprise, everyone around her will behave selfishly. Well, selfishly to a Vulcan. Of course, everyone on the Enterprise puts the Enterprise first, but there is wiggle room for them to express their own individuality. If T'Pol goes back to Vulcan, that will be the last choice she ever makes. She will be reinstalled with the standard Vulcan personality, and she won't be able to return to Enterprise, return to a situation where she is the only Vulcan on a ship. So she decides to stay on Enterprise, and I don't know how much of what I just discussed was conscious or subconscious for her, but it is, the title is called Breaking the Ice. It's the first crack in what appears to be hopeful for her, but also, Vulcans are considered to be extremely volatile. They keep control of their emotions because they're considered to be extremely volatile. But at this point, it looks like it's positively a good thing for her to have acknowledged that she at least has an appreciation for being on the Enterprise at all. It's a good first step, which is frustrating because the reason they're able to move with this level of granularity and characterization is because the series is so long and was expected to be so long. It was supposed to be 7 seasons. And it was just announced today that it's possible Netflix might be acquiring Paramount Plus, or Paramount, which owns Star Trek. That would be a nightmare. They've already gone away from this kind of characterization, but it would have to go farther away. We wouldn't have long-form Star Trek anymore. It would not be good. I really hope this deal doesn't go through. That would suck. Anyway, a couple of details from Breaking the Ice that I liked. We see T'Pol's room for the first time, and she actually has some decorations that appear to be like distinctly her. Her bedspread and some of the touchings around her room are purple with pink mandala flowers. This is undoubtedly something that she chose. Tuvok would not have purple with pink mandala flowers in his room. This is not... She has Vulcan sensibility to her decorations, but she has just a small amount of wiggle room. And underneath her cold exterior, there is a very slightly more sensitive, nice, and girly person that literally no one on Enterprise would mind if she was all the time. But she's been assigned a Vulcan personality, and the only aspect of herself that she has is that she has a favorite color. Notably, if she had gone home to marry this guy, she would not have been able to have that favorite color anymore, or she wouldn't have been able to have a pink and purple room. I also like the pie thing. It's a cute episode. I appreciate the level of character relationship depth that they attempt with Trip and T'Pol. I don't remember how much I will enjoy it going forward, to be completely honest, but they are able to take these small steps that are well done. I liked this episode. So that's everything that I had to cover for this week. I'm sure this was all over the place and rambly and crazy, but I will see you next time. I hope that this works out. I really love Enterprise. See you next time.